Sometimes life breaks you so completely, you forget who you were before the pain. Morris Crane knew that feeling better than most. At 48, his marriage was over, his carpentry shop had closed, and he was walking country roads with nothing but a toolbox and a worn duffel bag. That's when he found it, an old cabin buried in vines, surrounded by an orchard that hadn't bloomed in years. The place was falling apart, just like him. But instead of walking past, Morris made a deal with the owners. He'd stay and fix it up. With his own hands, he started clearing the land and rebuilding what was broken. He even grafted new life onto the dying fruit trees. What grew from that quiet work would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Morris Crane had built things with his hands for 30 years. Good things, honest things, cabinets that hung straight and true, staircases that didn't creak, furniture that lasted generations. His father taught him to respect the wood, to understand its grain, to know that every piece had a story locked inside, waiting for the right hands to reveal it. For most of his adult life, Morris believed he had those hands. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday in March, though if he was being honest with himself, the marriage had ended years before that. Diane hadn't left him for another man, or because of some dramatic betrayal. She left because they'd simply stopped being present for each other. He'd spent too many nights in his workshop, too many weekends taking extra jobs, too many dinners eaten in silence with sawdust still under his fingernails. She'd built her own life around his absence, book clubs, volunteer work, friends he'd never bothered to know. When she finally said she wanted out, Morris couldn't even argue. What defense did he have? She was right. The carpentry shop followed 6 months later. Crane Custom Woodworks had occupied the same corner space in town for 18 years. Morris had poured everything into it, his savings, his time, his identity. But the big box stores kept undercutting his prices, and younger customers wanted cheap furniture they could assemble themselves. His clients aged out or moved away. The rent kept climbing, while the work kept shrinking. He held on longer than he should have, draining what little savings the divorce had left him, until finally the landlord stood in his doorway with an eviction notice and genuine sympathy in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Morris. I really am. But I've got bills too." Morris packed his tools, sold what equipment he could, and walked away from the empty shop without looking back. Some things hurt too much to memorialize with a final glance. His daughter, Bridget, had called him every week since the divorce, her voice tight with worry he pretended not to hear. She was 26, working some marketing job in the city that required her to dress in clothes that cost more than his monthly grocery budget. She'd offered to let him stay with her, sleep on her couch, get back on his feet. The thought of it, being a burden to his own daughter, watching her tiptoe around her failed father in her small apartment, made something in his chest tighten until he couldn't breathe. "I'll figure it out, Bridget. I always do. Dad, you can't just wander around with nowhere to go." "I'm not wandering. I'm looking for work. Plenty of people need things fixed." That much was true, at least. He'd taken to walking the back roads outside town, knocking on doors, offering his services for cheap. Fence repairs, deck restoration, anything that needed a steady hand and basic tools. It kept him fed and put gas in his truck, but it wasn't a life. It was just motion, one day bleeding into the next, with nothing to show for it but a few dollars, and the growing certainty that he'd wasted the best years of his life building a foundation that had crumbled anyway. He'd been walking for 3 hours the day he found the orchard, following a rutted dirt road that curved through rolling farmland. The afternoon sun hung low and golden, turning the distant hills soft and hazy. His toolbox grew heavier with each mile, his shoulders aching from the weight of it when he spotted the chimney first, red brick poking up through a tangle of ivy and wild growth. Morris stopped, studying the scene. The cabin sat maybe 50 yards off the road, nearly invisible beneath decades of neglect. Vines covered the walls so completely he could barely make out the windows. The porch sagged like a broken spine, but it was the trees that caught his attention. dozens of them, spreading out behind the cabin in rough rows that suggested intentional planting. Apple trees, he thought. Pear trees, too. An orchard abandoned and left to die? He set his toolbox down and walked closer, pushing through waist-high grass and brambles. The trees were old, 50 years, maybe more. Their branches twisted and gnarled, many split or broken, bark diseased and peeling. Dead fruit rotted on the ground, filling the air with a sweet, sour smell. But underneath the decay, Morris could see the structure. Someone had planted these trees with care, had tended them once. The spacing was right. The varieties were deliberate. This had been something good before time, and neglect had taken it. The cabin door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Morris pushed it open carefully, watching for signs of structural collapse. Inside, dust covered everything like a grey blanket. Mice had nested in the corners. The furniture, what remained of it, had been chewed and stained by years of weather coming through broken windows. But the bones were solid. Log construction, probably built in the 30s or 40s. The floor felt sturdy under his boots. The walls were thick and straight. The chimney looked intact. He stood in the center of the single main room, turning slowly, and felt something shift in his chest. Recognition, maybe, or kinship. This place was broken, but it wasn't beyond saving. Someone had built this cabin to last, had planted those trees thinking about the future, about harvest seasons that would come year after year. And then something had happened. Death or disappointment or simple abandonment, and it had all been left to rot. Morris understood that. He was looking at his own life through a different lens. The property owners turned out to be siblings in their 70s, Francis and Albert Whitmore, who lived 2 towns over and had inherited the land from a distant uncle 3 years earlier. They'd meant to do something with it, they explained, when Morris tracked them down through the county records office. But they were old themselves, living on fixed incomes, and neither had the money or energy to restore a falling-down cabin and a dead orchard. "We've been meaning to list it for sale," Frances said, her voice apologetic. "But it's so run down, we don't think anyone would buy it." Morris sat in their small, tidy living room, his work clothes out of place among their lace doilies and family photographs. "What if I restored it?" he asked. "I'm a carpenter. Been doing it for 30 years. I could fix the cabin, clear the land. In exchange, I'd live there. No rent. Just let me stay and work." The siblings exchanged glances. Albert frowned. "You do all that work for nothing but a roof over your head?" "I need a roof," Morris said simply. "And I need something to do. Something that matters." Francis studied him with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You running from something, Mr. Crane?" "Running to something, maybe. I don't know yet. But I'm good at this work. I'll take care of the place. You have my word." They agreed to a trial period, 6 months. If Morris did right by the property, they'd consider a longer arrangement. He shook their hands, drove back to the cabin, and unloaded his toolbox and duffel bag onto the sagging porch. That first night, he slept on the floor wrapped in his sleeping bag, listening to mice scurry in the walls and wind whistle through the broken windows. The cabin smelled like rot and time and abandonment. But when morning light filtered through the vines covering the windows, turning everything green and gold, Morris felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, maybe, or just the possibility of it. He stood, stretched his aching back, and picked up his hammer. Time to get to work. The shed stood behind the cabin, half collapsed and nearly invisible beneath blackberry vines that had grown wild and vicious. Morris had been working on the cabin for 2 weeks, patching the roof, replacing rotted floorboards, clearing debris, before he even noticed the shed's doorway through the brambles. On a cool morning in early May, with mist still clinging to the low places in the orchard, he decided to investigate. The blackberry thorns tore at his sleeves as he pushed through. The shed door had swollen in its frame, warped by years of rain. Morris had to throw his shoulder against it twice before it gave way with a groan of protest. Inside, dim light filtered through gaps in the walls, illuminating decades of accumulated junk. Rusted garden tools hung from nails. Clay pots sat stacked and broken in the corners. A push mower lay on its side, more rust than metal. The air smelled of mold and old earth. Morris stepped carefully, testing the floor before putting his full weight down. His boot knocked against something solid, a wooden crate shoved beneath a collapsed workbench. He crouched down and pulled it free, recognizing it immediately as a tool chest. Cedar, the kind his grandfather's generation had made to last. The brass hinges were green with age, but still functional. He carried it outside into the daylight and set it on a flat rock. The lid resisted at first, then opened with a protest of metal on metal. Inside, wrapped carefully in oilcloth that had gone stiff and dark with age, lay a collection of specialized tools. Pruning shears, a small folding saw, several curved blades Morris recognized as grafting knives. And there, nestled in the center, was a folding knife with a bone handle worn smooth by decades of use. Morris lifted it carefully. The blade was spotted with rust, but the edge was still good. Someone had cared for this knife, kept it sharp, used it regularly. He turned it over in his hands and felt something shift in his memory, a door opening onto a room he hadn't entered in 40 years. His grandfather's orchard in Pennsylvania. The long summers Morris had spent there as a boy, following the old man through rows of apple trees while he worked. His grandfather had carried a knife just like this one, had shown Morris how to make clean cuts, how to choose the right rootstock, how to bind the graft with wax and cloth and patience. "You're not just cutting wood," his grandfather would say, his voice rough as bark. "You're giving something old a chance at new life. The roots know what to do. You just have to show them the way." Morris had forgotten those summers. Or maybe he'd buried them under decades of other things. Building a business, maintaining a marriage, keeping up with bills and obligations. But holding this knife brought it all back. The smell of cut wood and apple blossoms. The satisfaction of checking a graft weeks later and finding it had taken, new growth emerging from old wood. His grandfather's rare smile when Morris got it right. He stood up, knife in hand, and looked at the orchard with new eyes. These weren't just dying trees. They were heirloom varieties, probably planted 60 or 70 years ago when people still cared about flavor over shelf life. His grandfather would have known their names, would have recognized them by their bark and growth patterns. Morris moved through the rows slowly, studying each tree the way his grandfather had taught him. Most were in terrible shape. Disease had taken hold in the neglected wood. Dead branches needed removing. But underneath the damage, Morris could see the potential. Strong trunks, deep root systems that had weathered decades of drought and storm. These trees had been built to last. They just needed someone who knew how to help them. His phone rang, shattering the morning quiet. Morris fumbled it out of his pocket, saw Bridget's name on the screen, and answered. "Hey, sweetheart. Dad?" Her voice carried that particular tone, the one that meant she'd been worrying and was trying not to sound accusatory. "I haven't heard from you in almost a week. I'm sorry. Reception's spotty out here. And I've been busy. Busy doing what? Dad, I'm worried about you. This whole thing, living in some abandoned cabin, doing odd jobs, it's not sustainable. You need a real plan." Morris looked at the orchard, at the morning light filtering through the gnarled branches, at the knife in his hand. "I have a plan. Living off the grid isn't a plan. She stopped herself, took a breath. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "I know the divorce was hard. I know losing the shop hurt. But hiding out in the middle of nowhere isn't going to fix anything. Come stay with me, just for a while. We can figure things out together. I'm not hiding, Bridget. I'm rebuilding. Rebuilding what? A falling down cabin that doesn't even belong to you? Maybe, and an orchard. These trees—" He stopped, realizing how it would sound. "Never mind. Dad, please. I'm scared you're giving up. That you're just—" Her voice cracked slightly. "That you're disappearing." The words hit harder than she probably intended, because she wasn't entirely wrong, was she? He had been disappearing slowly for years, fading into his workshop, into his failures, into the growing silence of his marriage. But standing here now, holding his grandfather's knife with morning sun on his face and decades-old trees waiting for attention, he didn't feel like he was disappearing. He felt like he was finally coming back into focus. "I'm not giving up," he said quietly. "I promise you that, but I need to do this my way. Can you trust me?" Silence on the other end. "Then I want to, but you have to talk to me." You have to let me know you're okay. I will. I'll call more often. Deal. Deal. She paused. What did you mean about the orchard? Morris smiled despite himself. These are heirloom apple trees. Old varieties. The kind you can't buy in stores anymore. Someone planted them decades ago, and they've been abandoned ever since. But they're not dead, Bridget. They're just waiting. Waiting for what? For someone to show them they're worth saving. Another pause. When Bridget spoke again, her voice was careful. Are we still talking about trees? Maybe not just trees. Dad, I've got to go, sweetheart. But I'm okay. Better than I've been in a long time. I love you. Love you too. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The conversation left him unsettled, but also strangely determined. Bridget didn't understand yet, but maybe she would eventually. Or maybe understanding wasn't what mattered. Maybe what mattered was that he finally had something to pour himself into that wasn't already broken beyond repair. A voice called out from the direction of the road. "Hello, anyone home?" Morris turned to see a woman approaching through the tall grass. She was in her 60s, sturdy and practical looking, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Her grey hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore jeans and work boots like someone who knew her way around hard labor. "Saw your truck," she said as she got closer. "Figured I'd introduce myself. I'm Faye Hutchins, run the farm stand about a mile down the road." Morris shook her hand, appreciating the firm grip and the directness in her eyes. Faye Hutchins looked like someone who'd spent her life doing real work and had no patience for pretense. "Morris Crane. I'm staying here for a while, working on the place." "So I heard." Faye lifted the cloth on her basket, revealing fresh bread wrapped in paper and a jar of what looked like apple butter. "Francis Whitmore called to tell me someone was finally doing something with the old Brenner property. Figured you could use a decent meal. That cabin's been empty a long time." "The Brenner property?" "That's what folks around here still call it. The Brenner family owned this land for 3 generations. Built the cabin in 1934, planted the orchard a few years later. Made the best cider you ever tasted." Faye's expression softened with memory. "My husband used to buy it by the gallon every fall." "Said nothing else came close?" Morris accepted the basket gratefully. "What happened to them?" "What always happens. Old man Brenner died. His son never wanted to farm. Moved to the city, let the place go. Eventually sold it to someone who sold it to someone else. The Whitmores inherited it from an uncle who'd bought it as an investment and then forgot about it." Faye shook her head. "Shame, really. This was the finest orchard in the valley once." They walked together toward the cabin, Faye's experienced eye taking in the work Morris had already done. "You've patched the roof." "That's good. And the porch. You've shored up the supports." "Still a lot to do. The windows need replacing. The chimney needs repointing. And the orchard." Morris gestured toward the gnarled trees. "I'm not even sure where to start with that." "You know anything about fruit trees?" "My grandfather had an orchard in Pennsylvania. I spent summers there as a kid. He taught me some things, but that was a long time ago." Faye studied him thoughtfully. "These are heritage varieties. You won't find them at any nursery. The Brenners grafted them from trees their family brought west in the 1800s. Some of these apples, you can't get them anywhere else." Morris felt something quicken in his chest. "Are they worth saving?" "Worth saving?" Faye laughed, but it was a kind sound. "Morris, if you could bring this orchard back to life, you'd have something special. The kind of apples people remember from childhood. The kind that makes cider so good you dream about it." She paused. "But it's hard work. Years of work. And there's no guarantee. I've got nothing but time. And what happens when the Whitmores decide to sell? You put in all that work, and then you're back where you started." Morris had thought about that. Late at night, lying on the floor of the cabin, listening to the house settle around him, he'd wondered if he was setting himself up for another failure. Investing everything into something that wasn't his, that could be taken away at any moment. But then morning would come and he'd step outside to see the orchard waiting, and the doubt would fade. Some things were worth the risk. "I'll deal with that if it happens," he said. "Right now I'm just trying to fix what's broken." Faye nodded slowly, seeming to understand something unspoken. "Well, if you need help, I know a thing or two." And if you get any of those trees producing, I'd be happy to sell the fruit at my stand. Folks around here would pay good money for real Brenner apples. After Fay left, Morris spread his grandfather's tools on the porch and began taking inventory. The grafting knives were salvageable. They needed cleaning and sharpening, but the blades were good steel. The pruning shears were in worse shape, but he could work with them. He spent the rest of the morning cleaning rust off metal, remembering the feel of these tools in his grandfather's hands. By afternoon, he'd begun a systematic survey of the orchard. He walked each row, examining every tree, taking notes in a small spiral notebook he'd bought in town. Apple trees. He counted 23 still standing, though half were in severe decline. 4 pear trees on the eastern edge, all diseased but possibly salvageable. 2 cherry trees near the shed, both dead and needing removal. The work was meditative. It required attention, but not constant decision-making. His hands knew what to look for: signs of disease, structural weaknesses, dead wood that needed cutting away. His mind could wander while his eyes and fingers did their work. He thought about Bridget, about the worry in her voice. He thought about Diane, wondered if she ever thought about him, decided it didn't matter either way. He thought about his shop, about all the beautiful things he'd built that were now scattered in other people's homes, pieces of his life he'd never see again. But mostly he just moved through the trees, touching bark, studying branches, making plans. That evening, he sat on the newly stabilized porch steps with the bread and apple butter Fay had brought. The sun was setting behind the hills, turning the sky orange and pink. Birds called to each other in the orchard, settling in for the night. The air smelled like cut grass and distant wood smoke. Morris opened his notebook and began sketching a rough map of the orchard. He marked each tree by type and condition, drew lines connecting trees that might serve as grafting stock, made notes about which branches to remove, which needed treatment, which were already too far gone. It was the beginning of a plan, rough and uncertain, but a plan nonetheless. His grandfather had always said that orchards required faith. You planted trees you might not live to see bear fruit. You grafted in spring and waited months to see if it took. You worked years before you knew if you'd succeeded. It was work for people who believed in the future, who trusted that care and patience would eventually be rewarded. Morris hadn't felt that faith in a long time. But sitting here now, pencil in hand, mapping out a strategy for bringing dead wood back to life, he felt something stirring. Not confidence exactly, more like possibility. The sense that maybe, just maybe, he could do this. That he could take something broken and make it whole again. Inside the cabin, he'd made a small space livable. His sleeping bag laid out in the corner. A camping stove for cooking. A lantern for light, since the electricity had been disconnected years ago. It wasn't much, but it was his. No one telling him what to do or who to be. No expectations to fail at meeting, just him and the work and the quiet. He finished the bread and closed his notebook as full darkness settled over the valley. Tomorrow he'd drive into town, buy supplies, pruning sealant, copper fungicide, grafting wax. He'd start with the trees that had the best chance, work his way through the orchard systematically. It would take months, maybe years, but he had time. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he had nothing but time and a clear sense of what needed doing. Morris stood, stretched, and looked out at the dark shapes of the trees against the deepening sky. "All right," he said quietly to the orchard, to himself, to whatever future waited in the branches. "Let's see what we can save." 3 months into the restoration, Morris woke each morning before dawn and fell into bed after dark, his body aching and his mind finally, blessedly quiet. The work had rhythm now, structure. He divided his days into careful segments. Mornings for the orchard, afternoons for paying jobs around the valley, evenings for cabin repairs. The carpentry work had come easier than he'd expected. Fay had spread the word that a skilled craftsman was available for reasonable rates, and calls started coming in. A retired couple needed their deck rebuilt. A young family wanted custom shelving in their mudroom. A widower down the valley had a barn door that hadn't closed properly in 5 years. Morris took every job, no matter how small. The money was modest but steady, enough for materials and food with a little left over. But it was the mornings in the orchard that gave him purpose. He'd started with the worst cases, trees so diseased or damaged they were beyond saving. The cherry trees came down first, cut into manageable pieces and stacked for firewood. Several apple trees followed, their trunks hollowed by rot, their branches brittle and dead. It hurt to remove them, each one feeling like an admission of defeat, but his grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Sometimes you save a tree by cutting it down, clear space for the ones worth fighting for. The trees that remained received his full attention. He pruned away dead wood, treated disease, cleared competing vegetation from around their bases. And then, carefully, methodically, he began grafting. He'd found several wild apple seedlings growing at the orchard's edge, volunteers from fallen fruit, their root systems strong and healthy. These became his rootstock. From the older trees, he selected the healthiest branches and cut scions, small pieces of new growth that carried the genetics of varieties that might not exist anywhere else. The grafting process required precision and patience. Clean cuts with the sharpened knife, matching cambium layers exactly, wrapping the union with grafting tape and sealing it with wax to prevent infection. Then waiting, weeks of watching for signs of life or failure. Most attempts failed, but some took. And when Morris checked a graft 6 weeks later and found new leaves emerging from the union, the satisfaction was profound. Faye stopped by most weeks, always with food, increasingly with conversation. She'd lost her husband 3 years earlier to a heart attack. Sudden and devastating, the kind of loss that left a person unmoored. She'd kept the farm stand going because she didn't know what else to do with herself. The work kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. "You remind me of Bernard," she said one afternoon, sitting on the porch steps while Morris replaced a rotted window frame. "My husband. He couldn't sit still either. Always had a project going." "Is that a compliment?" Morris asked, testing the fit of the new frame. "Depends. He worked himself half to death. I used to tell him to slow down, enjoy what we had. He'd say he'd rest when the work was done." Her voice went quiet. "The work's never done, though." That's what he didn't understand. Morris set down his tools and looked at her. "I'm sorry. That must have been hard." It was. Still is some days. Faye stood, brushing off her jeans. "But I didn't come here to be melancholy. I came to tell you that the Hoffmans, they run the hardware store in town. They said you did excellent work on their fence. They're telling everyone who'll listen. It was just a fence. It was a fence that had been falling down for 10 years, and 3 other carpenters said wasn't worth fixing. You made it better than new." She smiled. "Word of mouth is everything in a small valley, Morris. You're building a reputation." After she left, Morris thought about what she'd said about her husband, about working himself to death, about the work never being done. He understood that impulse, the drive to keep moving, to stay busy enough that you didn't have time to think about what was missing. He'd done that for years in his shop, taking job after job, staying late, avoiding the empty spaces in his marriage by filling them with sawdust and the smell of wood stain. But this felt different. The work on the orchard wasn't avoidance. It was engagement. Every morning when he walked through the trees, checking grafts and pruning branches, he felt present in a way he hadn't in years. The orchard demanded attention. It required him to slow down, to observe, to respond to what the trees needed, rather than imposing his own timeline. In late July, the first grafted tree bloomed, just a handful of white blossoms on a branch he'd attached 3 months earlier. Morris stood in front of it for 10 minutes, just looking. The blooms were small and probably wouldn't produce fruit this year, but they were proof. The graft had taken. Old wood and new growth had fused, become one thing. His grandfather would have been proud. He called Bridget that evening, standing outside the cabin where reception was better. "Dad, I was starting to worry again. I know, I'm sorry, but I've got news. Remember I told you about the orchard? The apple trees you're trying to save? One of them bloomed. The graft worked." Silence on the other end. Then, That's good, right? It's better than good. It means the technique works. I can save these trees, Bridget. I can bring this whole orchard back. Dad. Her voice carried careful concern. That's wonderful, really. But what's the long-term plan? You can't live in that cabin forever. And what happens when the owners sell? I don't know yet. I'm taking it one day at a time. That's what worries me. You sound, I don't know, like you're building something that might not be there tomorrow. Morris looked out at the orchard, at the shapes of trees against the darkening sky. Maybe that's all anyone can do. Build what matters today and hope tomorrow takes care of itself. That's not like you. You always had plans, 5-year plans, 10-year plans. And look where that got me. The words came out harsher than he'd intended. He heard Bridget's sharp intake of breath. I didn't mean it like that, he said quickly. Those plans didn't save my marriage or my business. Maybe it's okay to not know what's coming. Maybe it's enough to just do the work in front of me and see where it leads. I guess I can understand that. She paused. Are you happy, Dad? Really happy? Morris considered the question seriously. Happy wasn't quite the right word, but content maybe, purposeful, at peace in a way he hadn't been in years. I think I'm getting there, he said finally. I think I'm on the right path. Then I'm glad. I really am, but promise me you'll figure out the future eventually. I don't want you to lose everything again. I promise. Love you, sweetheart. Love you too. After they hung up, Morris walked through the orchard in the last light, running his hands along bark, checking leaves for signs of disease, mentally cataloguing what needed attention tomorrow. The evening air was warm and still. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Closer by, insects hummed in the grass. He stopped at the blooming graft, barely visible in the dimness. Next spring, if all went well, there would be more blooms. And the spring after that, maybe fruit, small victories building toward something larger. It was enough. By September, the orchard had become something Morris could almost recognize. The rows were clear now, the grass trimmed back, the dead wood removed. 18 trees remained, not the full complement the Brenners had planted, but enough to work with. More importantly, 7 of his grafts had taken successfully. New growth emerged from old trunks, leaves bright green against weathered bark. It wasn't a harvest yet, but it was promise. The cabin had transformed too. Morris had replaced every window, repointed the chimney, rebuilt the porch completely. Inside, he'd installed a wood stove for the coming winter, patched the walls, and refinished the wide plank floors until they glowed honey-colored in the lamplight. He'd even run a temporary power line from the main road, paying the connection fee out of his carpentry earnings. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid. It was home. Faye's visits had become routine, expected, quietly essential. She'd arrive most evenings around 6, usually carrying something from her kitchen, a casserole, fresh vegetables, pie made from peaches she'd bought from another farmer. They'd eat together on the porch, talking about small things. The weather, the valley gossip, books they'd read. Gradually, carefully, they'd started sharing deeper things too. One evening in mid-September, with the air turning crisp and the light golden, Faye arrived carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of wine. I thought we should celebrate, she said, setting them on the porch railing. 3 months you've been here. Look at what you've done. Morris surveyed the property, trying to see it through her eyes. Still a long way to go. You always say that. When are you going to admit you've accomplished something remarkable? He poured the wine, handed her a glass. Maybe when I see actual fruit on those trees. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping wine and watching the sun sink toward the hills. Morris had grown to treasure these moments, the quiet companionship, the lack of pressure to perform or explain himself. Faye understood silence. She'd learned, like him, that sometimes presence was enough. Can I ask you something personal? Faye said eventually. Sure. What happened to your marriage? You don't have to answer if you don't want to. But you've never really said. Morris considered the question, the wine warm in his chest. Nothing dramatic. No affairs or big fights. We just drifted. I worked too much. She built a life that didn't include me. By the time we noticed, we were strangers living in the same house, Do you regret it? The divorce? No, we should have done it years earlier. But I regret not trying harder when it mattered. Not showing up for the life we had, he paused. I was so focused on building the business, on being successful, that I forgot to be present for the people who mattered. Faye nodded slowly. Bernard did that too in his way. Always another fence to mend, another field to plow. I used to get angry about it. Now I just miss him. She looked at Morris directly. Don't make the same mistake twice. Don't miss what's right in front of you while you're busy fixing everything else. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement maybe, of what was growing there. Neither of them was ready to name it yet. They'd both been hurt too recently, knew too well how easily connection could shatter. But the possibility hung in the air, like the scent of ripening apples, sweet and complicated. The next morning, Morris discovered something that would change everything. He'd been exploring deeper into the shed, clearing out the last of the accumulated junk, when his foot broke through a rotten board. Swearing, he pulled his leg free and knelt to examine the hole. Instead of dirt beneath, he saw darkness, a space below. It took him an hour to clear enough boards to reveal a cellar entrance, stone steps leading down into a cool, dark space beneath the shed. Morris climbed down carefully, flashlight in hand, and found himself in a room maybe 10 feet square, with a packed earth floor and stone walls. Along one wall stood shelves holding ancient mason jars, their contents long since spoiled. Along another wall sat barrels and equipment, a wine press, some kind of filtering system, and in the corner covered with canvas, something large. Morris pulled off the canvas, sending up clouds of dust. Underneath sat a copper still, small, beautifully made, dark with age but structurally sound. He ran his hands over it, recognizing the craftsmanship. This wasn't some crude backwoods operation. This was professional equipment, built by someone who knew what they were doing. He climbed back up into daylight and called Faye immediately. She arrived 20 minutes later, breathless with curiosity. Morris led her down into the cellar and watched her face as she saw the still. "Oh my," she breathed. "Oh, Morris, do you know what this is?" "A still. For making spirits, I assume." "Not just spirits. The Brenners made apple brandy. Really good apple brandy. They only produced a few bottles a year, sold them to restaurants in the city. People talked about it like it was liquid gold." She turned to him, eyes bright. "This could be everything. If you could get the orchard producing, if you could make cider and brandy the way the Brenners did, that's a lot of ifs. But possible. All of it's possible." She grabbed his arm, excited now. "There's a man I know, Lloyd Sutherland. He used to work for the Agricultural Extension Office before he retired. He knows everything about heritage agriculture, licensing, small batch production. We should talk to him." Morris felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Hope, maybe, but bigger than that. Vision, the possibility of not just restoring the orchard, but reviving it completely. Bringing back not just the trees, but the tradition, the craft, the legacy the Brenners had built. "What about money?" he asked. "Equipment, licensing, all of that costs one step at a time. First, let's talk to Lloyd, see what's actually involved. Then we can worry about the rest." They climbed back up into the afternoon light. Morris stood looking at the orchard with new eyes. Not just trees to save, but a business to build. A purpose that extended beyond personal redemption into something that could sustain itself, support others, create value that lasted. That night he couldn't sleep. His mind raced with possibilities and problems in equal measure. The trees wouldn't produce enough fruit for another year at least. He'd need to learn cider-making techniques he'd never studied. The still probably needed restoration. And underneath all of it, the nagging question of ownership. What was he building here? What right did he have to dream this big about property that wasn't his? But lying in the dark, listening to the wind move through the orchard outside his window, Morris realized something fundamental had shifted. For 3 months he'd been restoring the orchard because it needed doing, because he needed the work. Now he was beginning to imagine a future. Not just survival, but actual thriving. Not just fixing what was broken, but creating something new. It terrified him. But it also felt like waking up after a very long sleep. Lloyd Sutherland arrived on a Thursday morning in a truck that had seen better decades, pulling up the drive with careful attention to the ruts Morris still hadn't filled. He was in his mid-60s, lean and weather-beaten, with the kind of face that suggested he'd spent most of his life outdoors. When he shook Morris's hand, his grip was firm, and his eyes were sharp, with the kind of intelligence that came from paying attention. "Faye tells me you're bringing the old Brenner orchard back to life," Lloyd said, already walking toward the trees before Morris could respond. "Let's see what we're working with." For the next 2 hours, Lloyd moved through the orchard with the focus of a surgeon, examining each tree, asking detailed questions about Morris's grafting techniques, nodding approvingly at the health of the new growth. He made notes in a small leather journal, took photographs, and occasionally made sounds that could have been approval or concern. Morris couldn't quite tell. Finally, they returned to the porch where Faye had set out coffee and sandwiches. "Well?" Morris asked, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. Lloyd sat down heavily, accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "You've got something special here." "Really special. These varieties, I recognize at least 3 that are considered commercially extinct. The Spitzenberg, the Smokehouse, possibly a Newtown Pippin. If those grafts take and produce true to type, you're sitting on genetic material that people have been searching for. What does that mean, practically speaking? It means you've got options. The heritage apple market is growing. People are tired of the 6 varieties they sell in supermarkets. They want flavor, history, connection to place. You could sell fresh fruit to restaurants, farmers markets. But the real value," Lloyd paused, sipped his coffee, "the real value is in what you can make with it. Cider, hard cider specifically. And if that still downstairs is functional, small-batch spirits." Morris felt his pulse quicken. "Is that viable as a business?" "Could be. The artisanal spirits market is booming right now. People pay premium prices for authentic, locally made products with a story behind them. And this place," Lloyd gestured at the orchard, the cabin, "this place has a hell of a story. What would it take?" "To make it work?" Lloyd pulled out his journal, flipped to a fresh page. "First, you'd need to get the trees producing consistently. You're at least a year away from a serious harvest, maybe 2. Second, licensing. You'd need permits for cider production, and if you want to make spirits, that's a whole other level of federal and state regulation. Third, equipment. The still might be functional, but you'd need testing, probably repairs. You'd need fermentation vessels, bottling equipment, storage. Fourth, and this is the big one, you'd need capital. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars to do it right." The number hung in the air like a weight. Morris had maybe $3,000 in savings, accumulated slowly from his carpentry jobs. Tens of thousands might as well have been millions. "I don't have that kind of money," he said quietly. "Few people do starting out. But there are grants for agricultural heritage projects, low-interest loans for small farms. If we can document the historical significance of this orchard, show you're preserving something important, there's funding available." Lloyd looked at him seriously. "The question is whether you're committed. This isn't a hobby. If you go down this road, you're building a business. That's years of work with no guarantee of success." Morris thought about the grafting knife in his pocket, about his grandfather's patient voice teaching him to bind new growth to old wood. He thought about the 3 months he'd spent here, the way his hands had remembered skills he'd thought forgotten, the quiet satisfaction of watching something dead come back to life. "I'm committed," he said. Over the next few weeks, Lloyd became a regular presence at the orchard. He helped Morris develop a business plan, taught him the basics of cider making using small test batches, and walked him through the labyrinth of agricultural regulations. They cleaned and assessed the copper still. It needed new gaskets and some copper work, but the basic structure was sound. Lloyd knew a craftsman who could do the repairs for a reasonable price. Faye threw herself into the project with equal enthusiasm. She researched heritage apple varieties, contacted restaurants about potential markets, and started talking up the future Brenner orchard products at her farm stand. Her excitement was infectious, and Morris found himself caught up in it, despite his natural caution. One evening in early October, after a long day of work, Morris and Faye sat on the porch watching the sun set. The air had turned cold enough that they'd brought blankets outside, and Fay had made hot cider from apples she'd bought at another orchard. It was good cider, but Morris could already taste how his would be different, more complex, more interesting. The heritage varieties would give it depth the standard apples couldn't match. "You're thinking about flavor profiles, aren't you?" Fay said, amused. Morris smiled. "That obvious? You get this look, like you're somewhere else entirely." She shifted closer, their shoulders nearly touching under the blankets. "It's good to see you excited about something. It's terrifying, honestly. What if I fail? What if I put everything into this and it doesn't work? Then you'll have tried. That's more than most people do." Fay turned to look at him directly. "Morris, I've watched you these past months. You came here broken, and you've been putting yourself back together piece by piece, just like those trees. This orchard saved you. Maybe it's time to let yourself save it back." He met her eyes, saw warmth there and understanding, and something deeper he wasn't quite ready to name. "When did you get so wise?" "Around the same time I got old." She laughed softly. "But seriously, you're not alone in this. You know that, right? Lloyd's invested now." "I'm invested. Even Bridget, from what you've told me, is starting to come around. She called yesterday, asked if she could visit again next month, bring some friends to help with the harvest. See, you're building something here. Not just an orchard, a community, people who believe in what you're doing." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the valley. Morris thought about community, about the slow accumulation of connections he'd been making. The hardware store owner who'd started extending him credit. The couple down the road who'd recommended him to 3 other neighbors. Lloyd's patient mentoring, Fay's steady presence and growing importance in his life. He'd spent so many years isolated in his workshop, focused on his business to the exclusion of everything else. He'd thought success meant doing it alone, proving he didn't need anyone. But this, sitting here with Fay, planning a future with Lloyd's help, anticipating Bridget's visit, this felt more substantial than any success he'd achieved before. "Thank you," he said quietly.
For what?
"For showing up. For bringing food and advice and," he paused, searching for the right words, "for making this feel possible." Fay's hand found his under the blanket, squeezed gently. "You did the hard part. You showed up for yourself. Everything else follows from that." The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, delivered by certified mail that required Morris's signature. He knew before opening it that something was wrong. Good news didn't come certified. Inside was a formal legal document, dense with whereas and heretofore, but the meaning was clear enough. A man named Preston Whitmore, cousin to Francis and Albert, was contesting the will that had left the property to them. He claimed partial ownership based on an earlier version of their uncle's estate plan, and he wanted the property sold immediately, with proceeds divided among all potential heirs. Morris read it twice, his coffee going cold on the porch railing. Then he called Frances. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice already heavy with guilt. "Morris, I suppose you got the letter." "I did." "What's going on, Frances?" "Oh, Morris, I'm so sorry. We didn't know Preston would do this. He showed up last week with a lawyer, claiming our uncle promised him part of the inheritance. There's some old letter apparently from 20 years ago." She sighed, the sound fragile and tired. "Albert and I can't afford a legal battle. We're on fixed incomes. Preston knows that. What does this mean for me?" "I don't know. The lawyer says we can't make any decisions about the property until the dispute is resolved. And Preston," she paused, "he wants to sell to a developer, someone who's been buying up land in the valley for residential lots. Preston needs the money. He's been struggling financially for years." After they hung up, Morris sat motionless on the porch, the letter crumpled in his fist. 6 months of work. 6 months of believing he was building something that mattered. And now it could all disappear because some distant relative saw dollar signs where Morris saw legacy. He was still sitting there when a silver BMW pulled up the drive, incongruous and too clean for the rural setting. A man got out, late 50s, wearing expensive casual clothes that looked uncomfortable on his soft frame. He approached the porch with the artificial confidence of someone used to getting his way. "You must be Morris Crane. I'm Preston Whitmore." Morris didn't stand or offer his hand. "I got your letter." "Good. Then we can be direct." Preston looked around at the property, his expression dismissive. "You've done some work here." "That's fine, but you need to understand this isn't your land. You have no legal claim, and I have every intention of selling it to Sullivan Developments. They're offering $400,000. For what? To turn it into subdivisions. To turn it into homes for families. Progress, Mr. Crane. Something you seem to be standing in the way of." Preston pulled out his phone, showed Morris a rendering. Neat rows of identical houses where the orchard now stood. "People need places to live. This valley is growing. You can't stop that by playing farmer on someone else's property." Morris felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. "These trees are over 70 years old. Some of these apple varieties don't exist anywhere else. You'd destroy that for tract housing? I'd take a payday that's 30 years overdue. My uncle promised me this land. Francis and Albert stole it." Preston's mask of civility slipped, showing the bitterness underneath. "I've been barely scraping by while they sat on a gold mine. So yes, I'm taking what's mine. And you," he pointed at Morris, "you're going to pack up your tools and leave. I'm giving you 30 days. We'll see what the courts say. The courts will say I'm right. I have documentation, letters from my uncle, evidence of his intent." Preston climbed back into his BMW. 30 days, Mr. Crane. Then I'm having the sheriff remove you as a trespasser." Morris watched him drive away, dust rising behind the expensive car. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from fury at the injustice of it, at the casual willingness to destroy something irreplaceable for money. He called Faye first. She arrived within the hour, Lloyd right behind her. They sat at the kitchen table Morris had built from salvaged wood, the legal letter spread between them. "Can he do this?" Morris asked. "Just take it?" Lloyd studied the document carefully. "He can try. Whether he'll succeed depends on the strength of his claim, and Francis and Albert's willingness to fight." He looked up. "But even if he loses the ownership dispute, the process could take months or years. And you'd be in limbo the whole time. There has to be something we can do." Faye's face lit up suddenly. "Historical designation. Lloyd, you said these trees might qualify. For heritage agricultural site status, yes. If we could prove their historical and genetic significance, the county could designate the property. That would severely limit what could be done with it. No development without special review." "How long would that take?" "Normally months, but..." Lloyd pulled out his phone, started typing. "The County Heritage Board meets next month. If we could document everything fast enough, get it on their agenda, we might be able to get a temporary protection order while they review." Morris felt hope flicker cautiously. "What would we need?" "Everything. Historical records proving the orchard's age and significance. Botanical documentation of the varieties. Photographs, testimonials, evidence of the Brenner family's contribution to the valley's agricultural heritage." Lloyd looked at Morris seriously. "It would mean working around the clock. And even if we get it done, there's no guarantee the board will rule in our favor. But it's a chance. It's a chance." They spent the rest of the day strategizing. Lloyd would contact the State University's Agriculture Department, see if they could send a botanist to document the trees. Faye would talk to older residents, gather stories and photographs from when the orchard was thriving. Morris would compile everything he'd learned about the property's history and his restoration work. That evening, after Lloyd and Faye left, Morris called Bridget. "Dad, it's late. Is everything okay?" "Not really." He explained the situation, trying to keep his voice steady. "I might lose this place. All the work I've done, it might not matter." Silence on the other end. "Then what can I do?" The question surprised him. 6 months ago, Bridget had wanted him to give up on the orchard, come live with her in the city. Now she was asking how to help save it. "There's going to be a county hearing next month. We're putting together a case for historical designation. If we can prove the orchard's significant enough, I can help with that. Presentation, documentation, visual materials. That's literally what I do." Her voice was stronger now, determined. "Send me everything you have. Every photo, every piece of information. I'll build something the board can't ignore. Bridget, you're not losing this, Dad. Not without a fight. After they hung up, Morris walked out to the orchard in the darkness. He moved between the trees by memory now, his hands finding their trunks without needing to see. These trees had survived decades of neglect. They'd endured disease and storm and abandonment. And they'd come back when someone finally cared enough to help them. He wasn't going to let them be destroyed now. Not for money, not for convenience, not for some developer's vision of progress that erased the past to make room for a sanitized future. Whatever it took, however hard the fight, he would save this place. It had saved him first. That debt demanded payment. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of frantic work and mounting pressure. Morris divided his time between maintaining the orchard and gathering evidence for the Heritage Board hearing. Every hour mattered. Every piece of documentation could make the difference between preservation and demolition. Lloyd brought a botanist from the State University, a woman in her 40s named Dr. Iris Chen, who approached the orchard with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral. She spent 2 full days examining every tree, taking samples, documenting growth patterns. Her equipment was precise and scientific, but her enthusiasm was pure passion. She knelt beside the oldest Roxbury russet, running her fingers along the gnarled bark with something like awe. This tree is extraordinary. The growth ring suggests it's at least 80 years old, possibly older. And these grafts you've done, she pointed to Morris's work. You've successfully propagated genetics we thought were lost. When she finally sat down with Morris on the porch that evening, her expression was grave but excited. Mr. Crane, what you have here is remarkable. I've confirmed at least 4 varieties we thought were extinct in cultivation. The Roxbury russet specimens are particularly significant. They're grafted from stock that likely dates to the 1800s. The Spitzenberg here shows characteristics we haven't seen in modern cultivars. And that tree by the shed, I think it might be an original Newtown pippin, which Thomas Jefferson himself grew at Monticello. She handed him a thick folder, pages dense with scientific terminology and detailed photographs. I prepared a full botanical assessment. This orchard represents living agricultural history. From a genetic preservation standpoint alone, it should absolutely be protected. These trees are a seed bank, Mr. Crane. They're insurance against the genetic narrowing of modern agriculture. Will your report be enough to convince the board? Dr. Chen's expression turned more cautious. It's compelling evidence. The science is irrefutable. But heritage designation is ultimately a political decision, not just a scientific one. You'll need more than data. You'll need to make them feel why this matters. Make them understand what they'd be losing. That's where Faye excelled. She'd spent weeks tracking down former residents, people who remembered the Brenner orchard in its prime. They came to the cabin one by one, elderly men and women with memories that glowed like embers, each one adding another piece to the story Morris was building. A woman named Dorothy arrived with her daughter, bringing photographs in an old album. She was in her 80s, her hands shaking as she turned the pages. I remember buying Brenner cider every autumn in the 1950s. My father, he was particular about his cider. Tried every brand, every orchard. But he always came back to Brenner's. He'd buy 2 gallons in October and ration them through winter. Said nothing else came close to the complexity, the balance. When I tasted your sample, Mr. Crane, her eyes filled with tears. It brought him back. That's the flavor I remember from childhood. A man in his 80s named George recalled working the harvest as a teenager, learning about grafting from old man Brenner himself. He was exacting, that man. Made us wash our hands before handling the grafting tools. Taught us that each cut mattered, that we were working with living history. He'd say, these trees came west with our grandparents. They survived the journey we almost didn't. We owe them our best work. Another woman, Ruth, who brought photographs, yellowed images of the orchard in full production in the 1940s, workers on ladders picking fruit. Barrels of cider lined up for sale. The Brenner family, standing proudly in front of the cabin, 3 generations together. This place was the heart of the valley, she said, her voice breaking. Every fall, people came from 3 counties over. It wasn't just about buying apples, it was about community, about tradition. When it closed, something essential died. What you're doing, bringing it back, it matters more than you know. Morris recorded every testimonial, wrote down every memory. Bridget, working remotely from the city, organized everything into a coherent narrative. She created a timeline showing the orchard's significance across decades. Testimonials from community members, Dr. Chen's scientific assessment, historical records showing the Brenner family's contributions to the valley's agricultural development. The portfolio grew thicker each day. Photographs from different eras, botanical documentation with genetic analysis, historical records from the county archives showing the original land grant from 1884, newspaper clippings from the 1930s and 40s mentioning Brenner cider winning competitions, letters from regional agricultural societies praising the family's work. But even as the evidence mounted, Preston Whitmore's pressure intensified. His lawyer filed motions to expedite the property dispute, arguing that the heritage designation process was a delay tactic. The developer, Sullivan Developments, began conducting surveys of the land without permission, their trucks appearing unannounced to take measurements and soil samples. Once Morris came back from town to find surveyors' stakes driven throughout the orchard, fluorescent ribbons marking where houses would go. Each stake represented a tree that would be removed, a piece of living history that would be destroyed. He pulled every single one out, hands shaking with rage, and threw them in a pile by the road. Preston himself showed up twice more, each visit more hostile than the last. The second time, he brought the developer, a smooth-talking man in his 50s named Gerald Paulson, who tried to appeal to Morris's practical side. "Look, I understand you've put work into this place. I respect that. We're prepared to offer you $15,000 for your time and materials. That's generous, considering you have no legal claim to the property. It's not about money. Everything's about money. Mr. Crane, you're just too stubborn to see it." Paulson pulled out architectural renderings, tried to make Morris look at them. "We're planning quality homes. Families will live here. Children will play in these yards. That has value too. Not if it requires destroying something irreplaceable. Nothing's irreplaceable." "That's sentimental thinking." Paulson's friendly mask slipped slightly. "You're one man standing in the way of progress. The board will see that." After they left, Fay found Morris sitting in the orchard, head in his hands, the weight of the fight pressing down on him. "They're going to win, aren't they?" he said quietly. "Even if we present the best case in the world, they've got lawyers and money and political connections. I'm just a guy who fixes things." "Stop." Fay sat beside him on the ground, took his hand firmly. "You don't know that. And even if they do win the property dispute, if we get heritage designation, they can't develop it. That's the whole point of this fight. And if the board says no, if they decide tax revenue matters more than history, then we appeal. Then we fight harder. Then we find another way." Fay turned to look at him directly, her expression fierce. "Morris, I've watched you these past months. You came here broken, convinced you'd failed at everything that mattered. And you've been putting yourself back together piece by piece, just like those trees. This orchard saved you. Maybe it's time to let yourself save it back. What if trying isn't enough? What if I do everything right and still lose? Then at least you'll know you tried. That's more than most people ever do, and you won't be alone in the losing. We're all in this now. Me, Lloyd, Bridget, everyone who testified. This stopped being just your fight a long time ago." The County Heritage Board met in a conference room that smelled like old carpet and burnt coffee. 5 board members sat behind a long table at the front. 3 men, 2 women, all of them looking like they'd rather be somewhere else on a Saturday morning. The county attorney sat to one side, shuffling papers and looking professionally bored. Behind Morris, the room was surprisingly full. Fay had mobilized the community, and at least 40 people had shown up to support the preservation effort. The local newspaper had sent a reporter who sat in the front row taking notes. Preston Whitmore sat on the opposite side of the aisle with his lawyer, a sharp-faced woman in an expensive suit who looked like she'd never lost a case she cared about. Behind them sat two representatives from Sullivan Developments, looking confident and well-prepared, their folders thick with projections and plans. The board chair, a grey-haired man named Harold Simmons, called the meeting to order with a tired voice that suggested this was just another Saturday obligation in a long career of Saturday obligations. He explained the process, the criteria for heritage designation, the weight the board would give to various factors. His tone was measured and neutral, giving no hint of his own opinion. We're here to consider the application for Heritage Agricultural Site designation for the property commonly known as the Brenner Orchard. We'll hear from Sullivan Developments and Mr. Whitmore first, then from the preservation applicants. Please keep your presentations to 15 minutes each. We'll take questions after both sides have presented. The developer's representative stood, Gerald Paulson, the same smooth-talking man who'd offered Morris money weeks earlier. His presentation was slick and professional, displayed on a large screen with graphics that must have cost thousands to produce, charts showing projected tax revenue, housing demand statistics for the valley, architectural renderings of attractive homes with landscaped yards, young families visible in the doctored photographs. "The valley is growing," he said, his voice confident and persuasive, practiced at selling visions of the future. "Young families need housing. They're being priced out of the city, looking for quality of life in rural communities. Our development would meet that need while creating construction jobs, increasing property values throughout the area, and generating significant tax revenue for the county. We're talking about sustained economic growth, not just a one-time benefit." He clicked to another slide showing economic projections over 10 years. Sullivan Developments is prepared to invest $2 million in this project. That's jobs for local contractors and suppliers. That's infrastructure improvements the county won't have to fund. That's growth that benefits everyone, not just one individual. Paulson paused for effect, his expression turning sympathetic. "Yes, there are some old trees on the property. We understand they have sentimental value to some residents. We're proposing to preserve one or two as a historical marker, perhaps install an interpretive sign about the valley's agricultural heritage. But we cannot let nostalgia prevent progress. We cannot allow emotion to override economic reality." He clicked through several more slides, comparison studies from other rural valleys that had embraced development, testimonials from residents in those communities praising the improved amenities and services. The presentation was polished, compelling, built to appeal to practical concerns and fiscal responsibility. Preston's lawyer stood next, her presentation more focused on legal principles than economics. She spoke about property rights, about the fundamental American principle that landowners could determine the use of their property. Her voice was sharp and certain, the kind of voice that suggested disagreement was not just wrong, but vaguely unpatriotic. "My client has a legitimate ownership claim currently in litigation. But regardless of that outcome, the Whitmore family has owned this property for years. They have the right, the constitutional right, to determine its use. Heritage designation would effectively strip them of that right without just compensation. It would devalue their property by restricting development options. The county has no business telling property owners they cannot sell their land for its highest economic use." She pulled out documents, waved them for emphasis. "The precedents are clear. Unless a property has truly exceptional historical significance, and I'm talking about sites associated with major historical events or figures, heritage designation represents government overreach. We're talking about an old orchard, not a battlefield, not a founding father's home. Just fruit trees that anyone could plant anywhere." Several board members were nodding. Morris felt his stomach tighten with dread. The developer and the lawyer had done their job well. They'd made preservation sound impractical, even vaguely selfish. They'd framed it as one man's nostalgia versus an entire community's economic future. Then Lloyd stood up and something in the room shifted. He didn't have fancy slides or graphics. He had a laptop with simple photographs and 40 years of credibility. When he spoke, His voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with the land, not just theorizing about it. "I've been studying agricultural heritage in this county for 4 decades. I've documented orchards and farms, tracked the loss of heritage varieties, watched the slow erosion of what made this valley agriculturally distinctive." He paused, letting the words settle. "I've seen a lot of orchards come and go, watched farmland turn into subdivisions, witnessed the homogenization of our agricultural landscape. And I can tell you that the Brenner orchard is not just some old trees." He clicked to a photograph of gnarled branches heavy with apples, the fruit showing the distinctive russeting and coloring of heritage varieties. It represents living genetic material that exists nowhere else in commercial cultivation. Dr. Chen's botanical assessment, which I assume you've all read, confirms that at least 4 apple varieties thought to be extinct are growing on that property. 4 varieties, each one the product of decades or centuries of selection and cultivation. Each one adapted to specific conditions, resistant to specific diseases, offering specific flavors and characteristics. Lloyd's voice grew more intense. "That's not nostalgia. That's irreplaceable biological diversity. In an era when we're learning the dangers of genetic monoculture, when disease can wipe out entire crops because we've narrowed our genetic base, these trees represent insurance. They're a seed bank. They're living history that has practical, measurable value." He clicked to a historical photograph, the Brenner orchard in 1947, showing workers harvesting apples, the trees heavy with fruit, the operation clearly thriving. 3 generations of the Brenner family built this orchard. They didn't just plant trees. They grafted from stock their ancestors brought west in covered wagons. They developed techniques for growing fruit in this specific valley's conditions. They won awards at international exhibitions. Their cider was famous from here to San Francisco. Another click, a newspaper clipping from 1952 showing Old Man Brenner holding a trophy. This wasn't just a business. It was an agricultural achievement. It was craft and science combined. It was what we now call artisanal agriculture, though they didn't have fancy words for it. They just knew how to do it right. Lloyd turned to face the board directly, his expression serious. And then, like so many family farms, it failed. The economics changed. The children scattered. The land was abandoned. We almost lost it forever. But we didn't. Morris Crane has spent 6 months bringing these trees back to life using techniques most people have forgotten. He's documented every graft, every treatment, every success and failure. His work isn't just restoration. It's an act of cultural preservation. It's keeping knowledge alive that would otherwise die with the last generation that practiced it. Lloyd's presentation continued with methodical precision, building the case layer by layer. He showed photographs of Morris's grafting work, explained the technical skill required, the patience and knowledge necessary to successfully propagate heritage varieties. He quoted from Dr. Chen's report, emphasizing the scientific consensus that these trees represented irreplaceable genetic material. "You can approve another subdivision," Lloyd said, his voice quiet but firm. "God knows we've approved enough of them. Houses that look identical to every other house, in every other development, in every other valley, from here to the coast. Or you can preserve something genuinely unique, something that connects us to our past and points toward a different kind of future, one where heritage and sustainability matter as much as tax revenue." The room erupted in applause. Harold Simmons banged his gavel for order, his expression still neutral, but Morris saw something shift in several board members' faces. Lloyd had reached them in a way the developers' statistics couldn't. He'd made it personal, made it about more than economics. Vay stood next, and her testimony was simpler but equally powerful. She didn't have Lloyd's scientific credentials or his decades of professional experience. What she had was the authentic voice of someone who'd lived in the valley her entire life, who remembered what had been lost when the orchard closed. "I've run my farm stand for 20 years, she began, her voice steady despite the crowd. "Before that, I worked alongside my husband building that business from nothing. we've seen the valley change. We've watched farms get sold for development. We've seen open land disappear under asphalt and houses. And you know what? Those developments don't create community. They create neighborhoods where nobody knows their neighbors, where people drive in from the city, sleep in their houses, and drive back out again. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The Brenner orchard that created community. People came together there. They didn't just buy apples. They talked to their neighbors. They brought their children to see where food actually comes from. They connected to the land and to each other. I was a girl when the orchard closed, but I still remember the loss. It felt like something essential had been taken from us. Faye gestured to the people filling the room behind Morris. That's why all these folks are here on a Saturday morning. Not because they're against progress or because they're stuck in the past. Because they understand that some things once lost cannot be replaced. You can build houses anywhere. You can create subdivisions in any field. But you cannot recreate an 80-year-old apple tree. You cannot bring back genetics that took centuries to develop. You cannot manufacture the kind of community memory that exists around this place. She looked directly at the board members, her expression earnest. I know the developer's numbers look impressive. $2 million sounds like a lot, but that's short-term thinking. That's selling off our heritage for immediate profit. What Morris is building, it's long-term value. It's sustainable. It's something that could support this valley for generations, not just provide construction jobs for a year or two. More applause. Even some of the board members were nodding now. Preston's lawyer looked less confident than she had at the start. Then it was Morris's turn. He stood, his hands trembling slightly, and carried his grafting journal to the podium. The leather cover was worn now, stained with dirt and tree sap. The pages filled with 6 months of meticulous notes in his careful handwriting. He set it down carefully, along with a glass jar containing the fresh cider he'd pressed the day before, golden and clear, catching the fluorescent light. "I'm not a public speaker," he began, his voice rougher than he'd intended. He cleared his throat, tried again. "I'm a carpenter. Or I was, before my business failed and my marriage ended, and I found myself at 48 years old, with nothing but a toolbox and nowhere to go." He saw several board members lean forward, their bureaucratic distance softening slightly. This wasn't what they'd expected, not the detached professionalism of the developer or the legal arguments from Preston's lawyer. This was raw and human. "I found this property by accident. I was just walking the back roads, looking for odd jobs, and I saw the chimney through the vines. When I got closer and saw the orchard, all those dying trees, decades of neglect, I saw myself. Everything I'd built had fallen apart. Everything I'd worked for was gone. And here was this place that had suffered the same fate, abandoned, forgotten, left to rot." Morris opened his journal, the pages falling naturally to entries he'd marked with sticky notes. "This is from my first week. North Road, tree 7, severe fire blight, but the root structure is strong. Removed diseased wood, treated with copper sulfate. We'll attempt graft in spring if it survives winter." He looked up from the page. "That tree survived. The graft took. Last month, it produced its first apples in probably 20 years. He flipped through more pages, his voice growing steadier as he talked about the work that had given his life meaning again. "Tree after tree, I documented everything. Not because I thought I was doing something historic or important, but because my grandfather taught me that's how you work with orchards. You pay attention, you keep records, you respect the fact that you're dealing with living things that have their own timeline, their own way of being in the world. You can't rush them. You can't force them. You can only provide the right conditions and wait." Morris pulled out a stack of photographs from his journal, passed them to the board chair. "Before and after, that's 6 months of work. Clearing the land, pruning diseased wood, grafting new growth onto old rootstock. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. Old roots, new life. That's what this place gave me. A second chance. A reason to get up in the morning. A purpose that extended beyond just surviving day to day." He picked up the jar of cider, held it so the morning light shone through the amber liquid. "This is from the first real harvest. It's made from 3 heritage varieties, Roxbury, Russet, Spitzenberg, and what Dr. Chen thinks might be a Newtown pippin. These are apples most people have never tasted. Apples their great-grandparents might have known, but that disappeared from commercial cultivation decades ago. I'd like each of you to taste it. Not because I'm trying to bribe you, scattered laughter from the audience, but because words can't capture what we're talking about preserving. You need to experience it. He poured small amounts into cups and passed them to the board members, watched as they sipped, their expression shifting from polite obligation to genuine surprise. Harold Simmons took a second sip, held the liquid in his mouth for a moment, his eyes widening slightly. "That's what we almost lost," Morris said quietly. "That complexity, that depth of flavor. You can't get it from modern supermarket apples. It comes from genetics that took generations to develop, from trees adapted to this specific soil and climate, from knowledge that's been passed down and is in danger of being lost forever. It can disappear in a single bad decision, in one afternoon of bulldozers, clearing land for houses that could be built anywhere." Harold Simmons took another sip, studying the liquid thoughtfully. Two other board members were doing the same, their bureaucratic masks slipping to show genuine engagement. "The developer said we should preserve one tree as a historical marker," Morris continued. "But these trees aren't museum pieces. They're not dead history behind glass. They're alive, and they're producing, and with time and care they could support a sustainable business." Morris continued, his voice growing more confident as he spoke from the heart. "I'm not asking you to stop progress. I'm asking you to recognize that there are different kinds of progress. We can build another subdivision anywhere, tomorrow, next year, 10 years from now. Raw land exists throughout this valley. But this orchard, these specific trees, these specific genetics, they exist only here, only now. Once they're gone forever. No amount of money can bring them back." He placed his hand on the journal, feeling the weight of all those recorded hours, all that patient work. "My grandfather used to say that orchards require faith. You plant trees you might not live to see bear fruit. You graft in spring and wait months to know if it took. You work for years before you know if you've succeeded. That's what I'm offering here. Faith that something worth preserving is worth the wait, worth the patience, worth choosing a different path than the easy, profitable one." Morris looked at Preston for the first time, saw the man's rigid posture, the anger and need written on his face. "I know Mr. Whitmore needs money. I understand financial desperation. I've lived it. I'm not asking him to sacrifice for my dream. I'm prepared to offer him a solution. Give me 3 years. Let me establish this orchard as a viable business, prove it can generate sustainable income. If I succeed, I'll buy the property at fair market value using agricultural loans and grants. The Whitmores get their inheritance. Mr. Whitmore gets his share. And the orchard survives to produce for another generation." Preston's lawyer started to object, but Harold held up his hand for silence, his attention still on Morris. 3 years isn't long in the life of an orchard," Morris said. "These trees are 80 years old. They've weathered drought and storm and decades of neglect. They can wait 3 more years to see if I'm worthy of being their steward. All I'm asking is that you give us that chance." He picked up his journal and returned to his seat. The room was completely silent. Even Preston's lawyer looked uncertain, her prepared rebuttal suddenly insufficient against the emotional weight of what they'd just heard. Several people in the audience were wiping their eyes. Faye squeezed Morris's hand so tightly it hurt. Harold Simmons cleared his throat, shuffled his papers. "Thank you, Mr. Crane. Does anyone else wish to speak?" 3 more community members stood to offer brief testimonials. An older man who'd worked for the Brenners as a young person. A woman who ran a restaurant and promised to buy every apple Morris could produce. A teacher who talked about bringing students to learn about heritage agriculture and grafting techniques. Finally, Harold looked at his fellow board members. "Unless there are questions, the board will deliberate. We'll take a recess and announce our decision as soon as possible." The board members filed out. The conference room erupted in nervous conversation. Morris sat motionless, drained from the effort of speaking, from laying himself bare in front of strangers. Bridget leaned forward from the row behind, put her hand on his shoulder. "Dad, that was perfect. You couldn't have done better. "We'll see," Morris said, but he felt something like peace settling over him. Whatever happened now, he'd said what needed saying. He'd fought for what mattered. The rest was out of his hands. The minutes crawled by. 15 became 30, then 45. People started checking their phones, whispering speculation about what the delay meant. Preston sat rigid across the aisle, his lawyer occasionally leaning in to whisper something. He never responded, just stared straight ahead. After nearly an hour, the board members returned. Harold Simmons's face was carefully neutral, but Morris thought he detected something, satisfaction maybe, or relief. The room fell silent as everyone took their seats. Harold settled into his chair, arranged his papers with deliberate care. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Finally, he looked up and spoke. This was not an easy decision. Both sides presented compelling arguments. The economic benefits of development are real and significant. Property rights are important. We don't take the restriction of private property lightly. He paused, and Morris felt his heart sink. This was the preamble to rejection. However, Harold continued, and Morris's breath caught. After careful consideration of the botanical evidence, historical documentation, community testimony, and the unique circumstances of this case, the board has voted 4-1 to grant provisional heritage agricultural site designation to the property known as the Brenner Orchard. The room exploded. Morris felt the words wash over him, but couldn't quite process them. They'd won. The orchard was protected. Faye was crying and laughing at the same time, holding him. Bridget had her arms around both of them. Lloyd was grinning and shaking his fist in triumph. Harold banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. "Please, let me finish." The room gradually quieted. "The designation comes with conditions. Mr. Crane, you'll have a 3-year provisional period to establish the orchard as a viable agricultural operation. You'll submit quarterly reports to this board documenting progress, production numbers, financial sustainability, preservation efforts. After 3 years, we'll review whether the designation should become permanent." He looked directly at Morris. "This is not charity. This is an investment in agricultural heritage, but it requires you to demonstrate that heritage can be economically sustainable. If after 3 years you haven't established viability, the designation will be reviewed and could be revoked." Morris nodded, understanding. "That's fair. That's all I'm asking for, a chance to prove it can work." Harold turned to Preston. "As for the property dispute, heritage designation doesn't resolve ownership questions. That's still a matter for the courts. However, it does severely restrict development options, regardless of who owns the land. We strongly encourage all parties to reach a private settlement that respects both the heritage designation and the legitimate interests of the Whitmore, the family." Preston's lawyer was already gathering her papers, whispering urgently in Preston's ear. Preston listened, his face reddening, his jaw clenched. Then he stood abruptly and walked out without a word, his lawyer hurrying after him. But Morris barely noticed. He was surrounded by people hugging him, shaking his hand, offering congratulations. The community that had rallied to save the orchard was celebrating their collective victory. Outside the building, in the parking lot flooded with November sunshine, Frances and Albert Whitmore approached Morris hesitantly. Frances's eyes were red, but she was smiling through tears. "Thank you," she said simply, taking both of Morris's hands in hers, "for fighting for our family's legacy when we didn't have the strength to do it ourselves. For seeing value in something we'd almost given up on." Albert cleared his throat, emotional but trying to maintain composure. "We want you to have it. The property. We've talked it over, and we're prepared to sell it to you for the agricultural assessed value, not development value. We'll work out payment terms you can manage." "Preston," he glanced at his wife, "Preston will have to accept his share based on agricultural value. He won't be happy, but that's what the land is worth now with the heritage designation." Morris felt something break open in his chest, gratitude and relief and overwhelming responsibility all at once. "I don't know what to say. I promise I'll take care of it. I'll honor what your family built." "We know you will," Frances said. "That's why we're doing this. 6 months later, on a warm afternoon in late May, Morris stood in the orchard and watched the trees bloom. White and pink blossoms covered every branch, so thick the trees looked like clouds that had settled to earth.